David, please, for your first presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and honorable members of the committee. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear again today at this committee. Je suis ravi d'avoir l'occasion de vous parler du rapport annuel 2020.
It's a great pleasure to speak with you about the 2020 annual report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, known as NSICOP. Je suis ici aujourd'hui avec Sean Jorgensen.
Colleagues, since 2017, NSICOP has conducted 7 reviews, which were included in 3 annual reports and 2 special reports. We are currently conducting 2 new reviews, one on the security and intelligence activities of Global Affairs Canada, and another on cyber defense. And we've initiated yet a third on the RCMP's federal policing mandate. This 2020 annual report is the only consolidated overview of national security threats to Canada. J'aimerais souligner que les rapports du CPSNR.
I would like to emphasize that our reports are unanimous and nonpartisan. We prepare and finalize reports through consensus, and all members agree on final content, assessments, and recommendations.
I'll turn to the Jim Judd report, completed pursuant to the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. As the committee documented in its 2019 review of foreign interference, a number of states try to interfere in Canada's electoral processes. They use a number of methods, including covertly trying to influence, for example, riding nominations, or trying to promote one candidate or undermine another. It may involve illegal campaign contributions and efforts that seek leverage over officials to apply pressure. This happens to all parties, across all orders of government. Officials may be wittingly or unwittingly subject to foreign interference activities. In the cyber realm, it could involve foreign efforts to amplify social divisions, stoke hatred online, or to sharpen partisan differences. That latter point is important. Foreign states try to use partisan groups, even political parties, to pursue their own agendas. Par conséquent, le comité a appuyé les recommandations de M. Judd.
As a result, the committee supported Mr. Judd's recommendations to reestablish the public protocol well in advance of the next federal election and to extend the protocol's mandate to the pre-writ period. The committee also believed that the government should consider 4 other issues.
Ensure that the mandate of the protocol includes all forms of foreign interference. 2, consider including prominent Canadians as members of the panel. If a foreign state is trying to manipulate partisan groups, it may be more effective for a prominent, respected Canadian to alert the public about what's happening. 3, absolutely ensure that all political parties understand the purpose of the protocol and the process for raising a potential issue. And 4, consider how the panel would actually inform Canadians about an incident of foreign interference. This is important. Foreign states try to stoke partisan differences. We will want to be careful about publicizing such efforts and attributing behavior to particular countries. I will now turn, Mr. Chair, to the annual report's overview of 5 national security threats to Canada: terrorism, espionage and foreign interference, cyber threats, organized crime, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I will focus on the first 3 as they have changed the most since 2018, when NSICOP first addressed these threats. Terrorism. La défaite de Daesh en Syrie et en Irak en 2000.
The defeat of Daesh in Syria and Iraq in 2019 was a significant milestone in global efforts to counter Salafi jihadist terrorism. But it created other problems, including what to do with Canadians who had traveled to the area to support terrorist groups. As this committee knows well, those individuals may continue to pose a threat to Canada and its allies.
They're ideologically motivated violent extremists. These include individuals and groups which embrace xenophobic violence, anti-authority violence, and gender-driven violence. While the restrictions imposed as part of the COVID lockdown, such as limitations on travel, have disrupted terrorism facilitation efforts, the pandemic and the concurrent anti-racism protests have increased anti-government rhetoric connected to ideologically motivated violent extremism. Espionage and foreign interference. I should be clear that espionage and foreign interference are quite distinct. Espionage involves the theft of information. Foreign interference involves the use of clandestine means or threats to promote a certain position or objective. However, the security and intelligence community usually treat them as a single threat because the perpetrators, foreign states, often pursue them in tandem. In 2019, the committee found that foreign interference posed a significant threat to the security of Canada. That continues today. Le changement le plus important est
The most significant change has been to the threat posed by espionage. Foreign states are increasingly targeting Canada's science and technology sectors. The pandemic created opportunities for foreign states, most notably Russia and China, to target Canada's health sector, most notably in the area of vaccine development.
There are a wide array of cyber threats facing Canada. In terms of sophisticated state-sponsored threats, Russia and China remain the most significant. These countries continue to target government and non-government systems, including those that provide critical infrastructure within Canada, and more recently, those involved in vaccine development. Nous avons également vu des acteurs étatiques mener des campagnes de désinformation.
We have also seen state actors conduct online disinformation campaigns in Canada and among our allies. Those same actors also use sophisticated methods to target, harass, or threaten dissidents within Canada.
Threats to the security of Canada are fluid, and they are changing. These are all things which we, parliamentarians from across the political spectrum, should continue to pay attention to and seek ways to address through our hearings, our work on legislation, and through our engagement with Canadians. I'd be happy to take your questions, Mr. Chair, through you, to the committee members, reminding committee members that members of NSICOP have waived their parliamentary privilege. So I will have to be, of course, circumspect in answering questions with any detail that might take me into classified information territory. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGuinty. And this will start our first round of questions of 6 minutes. Mr. Kirk is having difficulties with the gap between the translations. Not quite sure what the issue is. It does seem to be a bit of a lag between when you switch languages from English to French or French to English. Mr. Motz, I see your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's something that we mentioned previously. When the speaker is done speaking French, and then whoever makes the switch between the volume from the French translation to the actual English pickup of the speaker, there's a lag of sometimes 8 to 10, 12 seconds, and you miss. You have to crank up your volume, or sometimes you can't even hear what they're saying. It's not the first time that we've had this experience.
Yeah.
It happens in the House as well.
The clerk is looking into it, see if we can shrink that time lag. So it's the best I can do under the circumstances, but we are on it as best we can. So with that, Ms. Stubbs, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. McGinty, for being here for your testimony and your very important work with the other members of your committee. I know that China has recently released its 6G strategy, which called for every action user to be registered, traceable, and exposed to censorship. And it seems to be the case that China seems completely undeterred by Western bans and maybe Western countries' domestic decisions. And I note too that your report says that one cyber tool could be used to track individuals in 45 countries. I just wonder if you would expand on that issue to the degree that you can. And if you have any thoughts about what is needed at this time to prevent countries like Russia and China from employing that type of censorship and manipulations, and whether or not a ban goes far enough, or if there's other actions Western countries can take.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Let me just perhaps begin. I think I detected an oblique reference to Huawei, perhaps in this question, but I want to be clear. The committee has not conducted a review of this issue. We have been briefed by CSC officials on the measures CSC has put in place to test Huawei products that are present in Canada's existing telecoms market, but I can't comment further than that in terms of that particular issue. I also want to just point out for committee members that the report is replete with references to China. That is a deliberate choice by committee members. In fact, in many different contexts, in 15 separate paragraphs, there are direct references to China and the activities they may be pursuing in a Canadian context. So with respect to, I can't go much further in terms of giving you more detail in terms of how the government might, or our security and intelligence community might respond more appropriately. I think it's important to remind members, though, that we did make a major recommendation to the Government of Canada in our 2019 report, asking the government to bear down on questions around the activities of China and to come to the fore with a whole of government approach. It seems that Minister of Public Safety, Minister Blair, has begun that process, but we're waiting to see more information from the government eventually to see, Ms. Stubbs, what that whole of government approach looks like.
Okay. Well, and certainly your report, as your testimony has done, outlines the clear threats of foreign intervention and interference to Canadian national security and economic security. Threats, I think, to us as a country as a whole and to individual Canadian citizens. And yeah, repeatedly mentions Russia and China as consistently bad actors. It seems in the case of China, it's been for a long time. But do you have any comment, or can you comment on whether or not there has been a difference or an uptick or a change in China's approach to Canada since the arrest and extradition, and then also the imprisonment of the two Michaels? Can you make any comments on that?
I don't think our report examined a before and after scenario from 2018 to 2020 in terms of the quantum of activity by China. I might ask, if I could, my research colleague Sean Jorgensen, for you, Ms. Stubbs, to respond, if that would be helpful. I think he might have a bit more detail for you.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, actually, Madam Stubbs, I would point to the 2019 report where we did identify a particular period, 2012, when Xi Jinping became essentially the president of China and took a very different approach to foreign interference globally. And we documented, for example, some very specific threats to Canada, where Chinese officials were coming to Canada to apply pressure on either Canadian citizens of Chinese origin or people who had come to Canada in their immigration process. So that was a very distinctive change in 2012, which, as I understand it, continues on to today, not just in Canada, but in some of our closest allies as well.
Thank you. And thanks, Chair. Well, hopefully we can get to this. On page 18, your report does note, quote, foreign states are increasingly targeting Canada's science and technology sector, and it does point to China's 1,000 Talents program as a perpetrator, and that through that program, quote, intellectual property is often transferred to China. So your report does note an increase in that. Can you expand about any details on that point?
Would welcome the opportunity to do so, but beyond what's in the text, Ms. Stubbs, on pages 18, well, under the rubric of espionage, it's very difficult for me to go into more detail. I think it's fair to say that increasingly our science and technology community in Canada, our academic community in Canada, is becoming more aware of the inherent risks. We understand that CSIS is now reaching out on a regular basis to brief academic experts and academic administrators on the reality of this situation, and we hope that this will raise the profile of the need to address this and to be aware. So that's a very important question. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. I'm advised by the clerk that this is a system-wide problem. So if those speakers who are switching from English to French or French to English could just give a little bit of a pause to let the system in effect catch up before they, as they switch languages, then I think that would be helpful to everyone. Mr. Lightbound, 6 minutes, please.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our two witnesses. One of the things that I noticed in your report is the change in terrorist threats in Canada. In particular, you talked about violent extremism based on ideology. The 2009 index showed that there was a 320% increase in incidents related to ideological extremism. There were a number of tragedies in Christchurch and in Germany, and that are related to violent extremism based on ideology. You also mention in your report that this type of extremism is different from Daesh in that it's less affiliated, less centralized. These are diffuse actors, and they're different compared to some of the more conventional threats that we've seen in the past decades. So what kind of challenge does that pose for our intelligence agencies, and how are our agencies adjusting to the change in the threat?
Thank you indeed, Mr. Lightbound. And we attempted in the report to reflect what we heard from the security and intelligence community. And what surprised us most in 2020 is the increase of activities in this area. Les EVCI en français, and the momentum seems to be seems to go faster and faster and spread to more and more groups with a higher number of participants. And we all know that the extremist messaging isn't always criminal in its nature. But we know that Canada has an ever wider basis and also provides a base where people can seek to recruit more and more people who, I don't know how to say this, but people who might be more vulnerable or open to being radicalized. And our security and intelligence services are concerned about what is happening in this area, particularly the increase in such activities. And this we were able to experience and witness abroad in New Zealand, for instance. And several episodes took place. And that we have happened in Texas, twice in Germany. And also we needed to look after other kinds of groups.
Growing threat. We know that it's increasingly overlapping with other IMVE type violent extremism. And of course, we saw a van attack in April 2018. We saw a stabbing in June 2019 in Sudbury. We saw an individual motivated by the incel ideology in February 2020, another stabbing in Toronto. So this is perhaps the most striking thing about this review for us in terms of, Mr. Chair, monitoring the trend. And Mr. Lightbound rightly points out that it's a surprise. It's a surprise, I think, to our security and intelligence community, but they are very much seized with this based on what we've seen and the information we've obtained.
Et est-ce que vous avez constaté à travers dans
In your report, did you notice a stepping up of these events and which would be linked to the pandemic? Did this contribute to radicalizing more the people concerned? Well, in each of the 5 topics or themes that we dealt with, at the end of the chapter, we did our best to provide a specific analysis of what happened since the onset of the pandemic of COVID-19 regarding those 5 fields.
We know that there has been a decrease in mass gatherings. We know that there have been a closure of public spaces, and that may have, for example, limits on travel. These things may have had a bearing on driving activity further online. So this is something that the RCMP is examining, and they believe it could result in people looking for advice or information over the internet and accessing what we call extremist echo chambers. So COVID-19, more social isolation, more financial hardship during the restrictions, we believe has likely put more of this type of IMVE and incel activity online.
Thank you, Mr. Lightbound. Madame Michaud, 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci, Monsieur McGuinty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McGuinty, for your work. So I want to make sure that the committee's mandate is to take stock of the threats and to provide recommendations to the Prime Minister. And after that, it is up to the government to make a decision on what to do or not what to do. Is that true? Yes. Madame Michaud, you're absolutely right to say that, yeah, we have a very, very determined and rigorous approach in order to carry out our reviews, and the reports are provided to the Prime Minister, and they might then be made public through the House of Commons. Thank you. So you refer to terrorism as being the major threat, but you also the most prominent threat. But you also mentioned cyber threats and other international issues. Now, do you perceive those new threats as a form of terrorism? For instance, foreign interference on social networks, including intellectual property. Are these new forms of threats? Madame Michaud, in the security and intelligence community, there is a perception of risks which is divided in 5 topics, terrorism, cyber activity, and so on and so forth, the 5 topics which we mentioned in our report. But I'm not sure that we can say today that there will be a moment when terrorism was moved to the online domain, as you seem to mention. But terrorism, this being said, terrorism is now, yes, promoting more activity on the internet on the part of terrorist-leaning people. Question. Regarding traveling during the pandemic, you said that this might have reduced the travels for the purpose of having terrorist activities. Answer. Yes, in our report, we have reflected what we heard from the RCMP and other agencies, namely that the very sophisticated approach that prevailed before the pandemic seems to have been dulled to some extent. It had been reduced, and so public places and people where people tend to meet or hold mass gatherings are less numerous. But I believe that my colleague, Mr. Jorgensen, might have something to add in this area. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only thing I'd add for Ms. Michaud is the reduction in travel also means, of course, reduction in air flights, which is one, as you know, one of the key threat vectors for terrorism. You've also seen, though, very significant reductions on immigration, and was another vector, for example, into certain countries, people illicitly coming into countries under the guise of immigration. So there's been a number of restrictions imposed on travel and movement of people that have in turn then restricted certain activities of terrorist groups as well.
Merci, c'est apprécié. Et j'aimerais revenir.
Thank you. Let me go back to the rise of far-right movements such as the Proud Boys. In Canada, it seems that this has been at the moment dismantled in Canada, but there is a kind of resurgence in the United States, for instance. And people say that there are networks such as QAnon. Let me find in my papers. Yes, that Canada is one of 4 main countries generating QAnon activities after the United States, the UK, and Australia. So there seem to be more and more people who are joining these conspiracy theories, and Canada is still vulnerable to this. So are we prepared to confront such a threat, although this is a new threat which we haven't had a chance to study so far? Yes, there is a lot of work to do, Madame Michaud. And if I may continue in English for a moment.
2015, at least 100 white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups existed in Canada. The vast majority of these are ideologically motivated violent extremism groups. However, our research, and this was also new to us, more recent estimates suggest that there are closer to 300 such groups across Canada. So there have been a major increase. Neo-Nazi groups active and growing. And clearly, as you rightly point out, Madame Michaud, the threat of IMVE, ideologically motivated violent extremism, is growing around the world. It's increased by 320% from 2013 to 2018. So it's a very serious matter for Canada. It's a very serious matter for our security and intelligence organizations, and it's a very serious matter for parliamentarians.
Thank you, Madame Michaud.
Yeah.
Mr. Harris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our colleague, Mr. McGuinty, for joining us today. Very interesting report. And you, first of all, I'd just like to ask you, you've called your report as an update of a threat assessment first undertaken by your committee in the 2018 report. Now, first of all, I'm one of those people who's not very happy to have a committee such as yours made up of not of Parliament, but of parliamentarians who report to the Prime Minister, who redacts the report, and we get to talk to you instead of you reporting to Parliament. But that being said, if you're doing threat assessments, shouldn't the Parliament require that these agents table an integrated and an unclassified, unredacted threat assessment to the members of Parliament, or to Parliament the same way that is done in the United States by the Director of National Intelligence there? Is that not a proper method of ensuring that Parliament is aware of the threats to this country?
I thank you, Mr. Harris, for the question. And I think committee members would consider that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is a proxy group for the whole of Parliament, both the House of Commons and the Senate. They have been cleared to a sufficiently high level to be able to hear the classified information for the first time in Canadian history, and work on behalf of all parliamentarians to hear the information, deliberate in a completely nonpartisan setting, and then, yes, deliver up a report that's classified to the Prime Minister, and from there it goes through the normal Canada Evidence Act process of redaction, and then is ultimately tabled. So we felt as a committee it would be helpful for Canadians, parliamentarians, and Canadians writ large to provide a single source of authoritative information on the threats to our national security. Hence the update from the 2018 first foray into producing that assessment.
But we know that the redactions are those that are related to national security. Well, surely, if the redactions involve that, then we're actually not getting the actual threat assessment. That would be my view, sir. You referred to, which is obviously the ideologically motivated violent extremism inspired attacks. Would you include in that? You mentioned the incel attacks and various other ones. Would you include that the coming to arrest the Prime Minister by crashing with a pickup through the Rideau Gates with a heavily armed pickup truck, and seeking to arrest the Prime Minister because of gun legislation that the person disagreed with? Would that be considered an ideological motivated violent extremist approach? And would that be something that would be considered a priority investigation by the RCMP, for example?
That's an excellent question, but it's not one that the committee turned its collective mind to, Mr. Harris. The timelines for this report, I don't think included, if I recall, perhaps Mr. Jorgensen could confirm. I don't recall if it included that particular event.
Does it seem to you, sir, to fall into that category? I mean, I'm not asking for
it may very
I'm not
well.
asking for CSIS's assessment or the RCMP assessment. What about yours?
It may very well, but I can't comment with credibility. I don't have the information that backstops whatever investigations taking place with respect to that particular.
But that would come under the rubric of a security threat of some kind to the country, where the prime minister, someone is trying to arrest the prime minister based on the activities that are publicly known. It's no secret. I mean, you don't need an investigation to know what was going on there.
Right.
But that would be a security threat to the country, would it not?
I would think it would be a security threat that our security and intelligence folks would be paying very close attention to, yes.
Tell me, we see that in other countries who have similar bodies such as yours, they, like the UK, for example, gives out a report noting the amount of efforts that are devoted to particular topics, such as we've been told that the UK report talks about the allocation of effort of MI5, which is similar to CSIS, and says that as of March 18th, they were devoting 67% of its efforts to investigating and disrupting Islamist terrorism. Do you think it would be useful and helpful for your committee to be assessing that kind of effort, so we would have an idea as members of Parliament and the public as to what effort is being placed against particular activities? Is that something you would consider doing in the future?
It may very well be something that the committee considers. One of the opportunities coming for Parliament soon enough is the 5-year review of the statute that creates the committee. That may very well be something that the House may want to debate or consider in the statutory authority. The ISC in Britain has a slightly different structure than ours. We choose topics based on a series of criteria that we arrived at early on when the committee was first created. And I think your question, which is really important, also raises, Mr. Harris, the question of recommendations, I think, from the committee to the government and whether the government is responding adequately or not. We said something about that as well in the report.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Unfortunately, your time's up.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Kirk, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. McGuinty for your work and leadership provided on this important file. The report notes that some ISIS sympathizers were not active combatants, but I imagine that most of those captured would make that claim. ISIS terrorists who participate in fundraising, planning, recruitment, and propaganda, and I'm sure that over COVID, a lot of this has been moved online, but I would suggest that that's a pretty big threat as well. With 61 individuals identified as having returned to Canada, have they faced repercussions for those crimes?
Well, that's a really important question, Mr. Kurek, and the committee obviously looked at this very closely, but did not review the issue of repatriating foreign fighters or the broader issue of extremist travelers as a part of this annual report. We do, of course, speak from paragraphs 24 forward. I think that's what you're alluding to the international terrorism environment. We have named the numbers. What we're presenting here is the accurate numbers, those who are detained, those who are at large, and those who are dead. The numbers remain unclassified, so we are in a position to do so. And that's as far as the committee was able to go in this particular area that you're raising.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. And this is, it deals with such interconnected and complex issues. I've noted that it's common to make mention of far right groups rather than calling them what they are, hate groups. And certainly, as I've watched conservative and liberal and other political parties, lives and whatnot, you see the comments. There's hate coming from all sides, and it is absolutely tragic. Is there any distinction from your experience between hate groups and the groups that the report calls ideologically motivated violent extremists? Is there a differentiation?
I know that there's a debate around the nomenclature and the choice of words to describe these. I
Je sais qu'il y a un débat très important sur ces définitions et toutes les nuances qu'ils contiennent. Nous avons un collègue qui est en train de dépister tout cela pour...
Yeah, and
Can you repeat that, perhaps?
yeah,
So can we
please.
back up on that, Mr. McGinty, and just start your response in English again, please?
Sure. I'm saying to Mr. Keurig that there's an important debate, I understand, around the nomenclature and the language that is appropriate. I think Mr. Jorgensen would be best placed to give us an idea now of where that lies and whether that's something that has reached the committee for deliberation. I do not recall, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, Mr. Kirk. So I think there's a very clear distinction between extremists and over time, extremists have been identified as being everything from promoting women's rights to equality for Black people in the United States, for example. So there's that very clear distinction between that and people who then take any type of extremist position into a violent realm. And so this is where I think that CSIS has worked very hard with its international allies and partners to essentially focus on the behavior and not necessarily the motivation. So we know that it's ideological. That's what makes it, for example, terrorism. But I see your point that it's not right wing, it's not left wing. It is what's the violent basis for that behavior.
All right. And my last question, and I'll try to kind of squeeze two in here. One is espionage related to Canada's research institutions, and you've noted it in paragraph 55 as a major target for foreign espionage, and certainly in the midst of COVID, we've seen a changing dynamic related to that. So that's my first question, and then my next question is specific to the protection of our democratic institutions and the integrity of the electoral process, and certainly just the need to ensure that our elections are protected, so that Canadians can trust that foreign interference is identified and stopped. Because of course we read the headlines, but it's often the more clandestine operations or and with the proliferation of online issues, certainly there's that threat. So I'm wondering if you could, in the short amount of time that I'm sure that's available, kind of identify the threat to research institutions and then also actions that could be taken or recommendations to whether that be Elections Canada or law enforcement regarding the protection of our democracy.
Mr. Keurig has stretched his 5 minutes quite magnificently. Mr. McGinty, could you respond to those very important questions in less than 30 seconds?
I'll do my best. Paragraph 45 onwards for members and for Canadians describes this question of espionage in the science and technology field. We talk about the 1,000 Talents program. We talk about the threat from Russia and China. We talk about new technologies being increasingly the focus and targeted by foreign states. And we talk about the risk to critical infrastructure, our electricity grid and beyond. On the question of electoral integrity, that's precisely why, Mr. Keurig, we as a committee focus so heavily on the Jim Judd report to assess whether or not the mechanism that was put in place by the government, a 5-person panel to deal with foreign interference, cyber in nature primarily, be expanded. We've made 4 or 5 recommendations to include, for example, in-person, more traditional foreign interference, so that would be caught. We also made some recommendations as to how that would be communicated to Canadians if there were an occurrence, Mr. Chair, because this would happen in the context of a usually heated and usually partisan campaign context, healthy and normal. But we want to make sure that if this was to occur, as it has occurred in the United States and other jurisdictions, we're best prepared to deal with it.
Thank you, Mr. McGinty. Neither you nor I know anything about partisanship. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes, please.
15 minutes? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, I was getting excited.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Mr. McGinty for being here. I've been on a lot of committees and sat in front of an awful lot of testimony, and I have to tell you that none have been as exciting frightening, terrifying as some of the testimony that we're hearing from you. So thank you very much for the work that you do on behalf of your committee. I also want to just a quick little kudos to the members of this committee as well. I'm a new member of this committee, but I have to tell you that very insightful questions, very respectful dialogue, and I'm nothing but impressed with this committee since becoming a new member. Kudos to the chair, of course, for handling things in such a professional way.
Okay, get
Mr.
to your
McGinty,
question, will you, Mr. Fisher?
Yeah. Mr. McGinty, in your report, your committee's report, you referenced the Terror Code listings process. So before 2019, there were no ideologically motivated violent extremist groups listed as territory entities, and now there are 6 white supremacist organizations, including, of course, the Proud Boys. Now, during your conversation with MP Michaud, you also said something about 100 organizations. Then you said that you believe that there may be as many as 300. I'm interested in your opinion on what impact does a listing process have?
Again, it's not something that the committee examined directly, Mr. Fisher. But I think it's fair to say that listing a group is exposing a group. It is making more available to the Canadian people information about some of the activities that these groups pursue, what's at risk, which is what we've tried to capture in this report based on the classified information we've received on this front. But listing, and it's not just one government that's listed, there have been other governments that have listed, and it's an important tool. But the proliferation of these groups is what I think also surprised us. It's the quantum leap in numbers that really had us as a committee together. And we have a member of this NSICOP committee on the Public Safety Committee, and Mr. Motz, who will recall we all sort of shook our collective heads, and we thought at first it was a misprint, but this rapid increase in IMVE is of significant concern.
Do you have any concern that by listing these groups that brings this relative fame, maybe encourages some groups to start the process, form groups?
I couldn't really say whether the infamy of it will drive people to participate or sign up. But I think in order for us as Canadians and as parliamentarians to know what we're dealing with, I think we have to have this in the open. This is, I think, a core message of the committee in this report is this isn't going away. It's increasing. It's increasing in numbers. It's increasing in groups. It's increasing in online traffic. It's a source for recruitment. It's a source for radicalization. And it would be very helpful for parliamentarians for Canada to build on some really important work that's going on now, Mr. Fisher, to try to understand why this is happening. And this is not just happening in Canada. The report sets out clearly it's happening globally. It's happening in the United States. It's happening in France, Germany, the UK. And so we're going to have to wrestle this to the ground and have a better understanding. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to give this important profile in the report.
How about online hate legislation like we see in Australia? Is that, do you see the benefit of taking action against this type of online violence before it has real world implications?
Not something the committee examined. It might very well be. It would be a very important issue for Public Safety Committee to examine. For example, would that be a contributing factor to help? But clearly, I guess I just want to repeat the message. This isn't going away. It's expanding in reach and size and scope and seriousness. And so I think we're going to have to deal with this now collectively.
And thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I can't but make a link between cyber attacks and the pandemic that we're going through. You indicated that China and Russia have been upping the game in these attacks, cyber attacks, particularly by way of disinformation or misinformation campaigns. In Europe, we see that they've been fudging the numbers as to the vaccines, BioNTech, etc. Some emails have been hacked into and published on the dark web. I'm glad to see that we're increasing on our manufacturing capacity, because this is not the last pandemic we're going to see, and it's a very severe threat to the public. Absolutely. The impact on public health and impact on R&D in Canada, on the Canadian economy itself. It's far-reaching, it's widespread throughout the society. And we've tried to describe as clearly as possible paragraphs 65 to 67, 68, the actual happenings in that sector.
And sophistication of cyber threat actors is increasing. Second, CSC says state-sponsored programs from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea pose the greatest strategic threat to Canada, likely attempting to develop cyber capabilities to disrupt Canadian critical infrastructure, energy systems, water systems, our grid, traffic flow control. Third, it notes that state-sponsored actors continue to conduct commercial espionage against our businesses, academic and government, to steal intellectual property. And fourth, CSC tells us that online foreign influence campaigns are ongoing and are not limited to major political events like elections. Donc on voit que c'est un peu partout.
So we see that it's very widespread, and it has been described as accurately as possible for the parliamentarians and the Canadian public, so that they can better understand that it is throughout all economic sectors. It's in our universities and research centers and so forth.
Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's lots of questions to rise, but I do have to ask one overriding question having to do with the mandate of your committee. My understanding initially was that there was a great deal of interest in having an oversight of the various security and intelligence agencies that are operating in secret, as is their want, as is expected, and make sure that they're following their policies and their practices are in keeping with the law and accordance with the expectations of Canadians. What kind of activities have you undertaken in that regard? I know we were talking about threats here and threat assessments, but what about that oversight? What's been done in that area?
There was a debate, Mr. Harris, when this committee was first being contemplated in Parliament, of course. What is it? Is it an oversight committee, or, which is perhaps a better description of the American congressional committees, the nature of those committees, compared to a review committee, which NSICOP has become and is. The decision was taken by Parliament to make it a review body to look back over time with a broad mandate to be able to examine many, many issues, and to get access to the classified information, ask the right questions, call in witnesses. Each review brings 10 to 30 or 40,000 pages of material. And then, of course, provide a report to the Prime Minister, as I mentioned, in classified form, have it redacted, and present it to Canadians. So we haven't really focused so much on the question of anything but review.
So if there's a question then of somebody misbehaving or doing something inappropriate, as a Parliament or as a country have to revert to such things as like the O'Connor Commission or the Yakabuchi Commission, rather than ask NSICOP to deal with questions of whether or not these things are appropriate and what recourse individuals might have if they're handled badly in a negative way, as we've seen happen through security activities in the past.
Or that matter, those types of lawfulness questions, just-in-time lawfulness questions, can be dealt with by the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, NSIRA.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Mr. Van Popta, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McGinty, for being here and telling us about your National Security and Intelligence Committee report for 2020. In this report, you highlight the growth, I think you say quantum growth, of what you're calling IMBE, ideologically motivated violent extremism. You've answered some questions about that already, so thank you for that clarification. But I'm trying to get a grip on how significant this growth is and whether individuals who are involved in these hate groups are identifiable, or whether, what's the nature of their communities? Are they just online communities, or are they real identifiable people? You make reference to a couple of geographical locations in Canada, like southern Alberta, southern Quebec, and somewhere in Ontario as well. So what's the nature of these groups?
Well, I think the report, Mr. Van Popta has made it clear that obviously there's an online virtual community, which is growing in number, growing in number of groups and number of participants. But the security and intelligence organizations have indicated to us that there are clusters in the country. And so we've tried to represent that accurately. Beyond that, I don't know if I can offer any more detail in terms of the individuals or names and so on and so forth. Most of that would have been, of course, removed.
Would have been redacted. But I mean, I'm not looking for names, but there are identifiable individuals who are involved in this subversive activity in Canada.
Well, there is, and the concern the committee wanted to raise with Canadians is that this is a very large group. We know that we found Canadians are highly active across 6,600 identified right-wing extremist channels, pages, groups, and accounts. 6,600. The study that we looked at also pointed to one prominent message board on which Canadians are more active than American or British users. What this means is that Canada has a very large base from which to recruit or from which to seek to radicalize participants. And that was a very big surprise to the committee as we received the information.
I think that's a very big surprise to all Canadians. It certainly is to me. I had not expected that. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. The report makes reference to a couple of incidences in other countries like New Zealand, right? The Christchurch shooting and a copycat shooting in El Paso. And I think there might have been one or two in Europe as well. Are there any indications of that type of event happening in Canada? I know there's reference also to the 3 incel motivated attacks in Canada. Any others that we should know about?
Any events that we were able to present to Canadians, Mr. Van Popta, for the period that we were reviewing, we have presented.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I just have one comment, and that is I want to put a motion to the meeting. I was so happy to see this report from the subcommittee on what we're going to study over the next couple of meetings. As a new member of the committee, I was getting quite frustrated that things were going so slowly, and I'm happy that we're getting close to the end of our study on systemic racism and on the parole board incident and on the Bastrash report. And so I'm so happy to see this report, and I would move a motion that the report be adopted. Thank you.
Okay. I would prefer not to deal with it at this point and prefer to deal with it at the end of Mr. McGinty's testimony. And if that's acceptable to you, then we'll do that. With that, we're moving on to Madame Demoff. And 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. McGinty, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here. As you know, I was on the Public Safety Committee when we studied Bill C-22, which created the committee. And it was my amendment that brought you here. So it's something that it was actually Matthew Dubé who reminded me of that in the last Parliament, that I was the one who had brought in that amendment. But I'm just sitting here so proud of the work that you and the other members of the committee have done, and just how important it is for you to share the report with all of us and with Canadians. So thank you for that. You know, when I was looking at the report, Mr. Van Popta was asking about, you know, what are these groups? And you had mentioned this earlier, but it's a form of extremism that encompasses xenophobic violence, anti-authority violence, gender-driven violence, and other grievance-driven. And then it talks about CSIS saying it's a common belief that the success or survival of society, civilization cannot be separated from the need for ongoing violence against a perceived threatening group. Example, the elite, visible minorities, religious groups, corporations, immigrants, capitalists, the government. And I have to say, I have noticed over the last 2 years, certainly an increase in the tone of comments that I see online and on posts that I make. And I was really disturbed in the report, and you just mentioned it when you mentioned how many Canadians, the report that you mentioned from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue said Canadians are highly active across 6,600 identified right-wing extremist channels, pages, groups, and accounts. And since they tend to organize online, it means that these messages are spread quicker. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how this online presence is contributing, and maybe you can't comment on this, and that's okay if you can't, but how an online presence allows these messages from these IMVE groups to spread quickly.
I can't get into any more detail than is in the report on this, but let me maybe repeat a few points. This rapid growth of IMVE is a very significant concern for Canadians, we believe. We believe this is true among our closest allies, and it's true in Canada. We've had enough comparative information classified as well, talking about what is going on in other places, and it's very, very concerning. These violent anti-authority groups, a number were recently listed as terrorist entities, including the Proud Boys, which apparently announced this week they were disbanding, I understand. But we've seen some unbelievable, horrific crimes against women committed by individuals motivated by misogyny. We've seen the growth of neo-Nazi groups, groups espousing hatred against immigrants, against racialized communities, the LGBTQ community. Anything we can do as parliamentarians to raise the profile of this new reality, this growing reality, and to find ways to address it, I think would be very, very, very welcome today.
So you mentioned in the report, and you touched on it now, how the pandemic has impacted the number of people who have been drawn to this. And I mean, the numbers you gave to us were actually frightening, 320% increase. And I suspect that number is even higher given what you've seen during COVID. I just wondered if you could comment on that, please.
Not much to add, except to say that what we tried to do in the report was to apply a COVID lens at the end of each of the 5 core threat areas to say, well, what really has happened here under the COVID-19 pandemic? And it appears that the evidence indicates that it's pushing activity online, more subterfuge, more connectivity inside the country, between countries. I think Mr. Jorgensen could add a little bit more to that, Ms. Demoff, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would just make 2 points. The one is the monitoring of extremism and how that is being pushed underground. And you would recognize, of course, that the security intelligence organizations don't necessarily monitor extremism per se, because being an extremist is not, it may be vile speech, but it's not illegal. And it is actually identifying when that extremism becomes violent. And I think that's the second point I would make, is that the S&I community, security intelligence community, has been very clear. It is very difficult in this environment to identify someone who has become radicalized, and then the time that takes then to become violent. And that time frame has reduced considerably. And I know that that's something that security intelligence organizations really struggle with. And that actually gets to your first point. What is the impact of that online hatred? And I think that that's one of the key issues.
Thank you, Madame Demoff. Colleagues, that brings us over the hour that is allocated to Mr. McGuinty. I note that he is quite popular and members are quite keen. And Mr. Motts had seemed to hope that we would go a little bit beyond normal. I'm in the hands of colleagues as to whether we have a third round or some partial expression of a third round. I see Mr. Couric seems to be enthusiastic. Ma'am?
Chair, I think it's important, given the testimony we've heard, that we deal with the motion that you got, the 1064 today. So I would say no to a third round.
Mr. Harris?
Well, I was going to speak in the other direction and suggest that we do have a third round. I don't think we're going to need all the rest of the time to deal with either the 106 motion or the motion from the subcommittee.
Madame Michaud.
I agree with Mr. Harris. I agree with the third round.
Okay. Based on that, I think we will have a third round. I'll just possibly, in light of Madame Demoff's comments, we'll just chop it in half. And it'll be 2.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes, a minute, 2.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes. I'm assuming that's all right with you, Mr. McGuinty?
That's fine, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Therefore, I'm looking for a representative of the Conservative Party for 2.5 minutes. And then the Liberal Party. I didn't know that anybody was that shy.
Hi, Mr. Chair. We're just trying to figure out a little bit of a surprise, which is never a bad thing. So thank you very much for this and the committee's willingness. Specifically, Mr. McGuinty, regarding organized crime and the fact that it seems, both from this report and other things that I've read, that Canada has become a haven for money laundering. International crime groups are using Canada to launder up to $100 billion a year, and this seems to be a fraction of the massive amounts laundered per year globally, but still a significant issue. Is money laundering a symptom of a growing number of criminal organizations, or a product of the lack of concentration on this issue, or a combination of both?
Mr. Couric, I think it's a combination of both. Okay. And the report from paragraph 87 forward lays out the nature of what is happening, some of the changes, what's happening in the drug trade, what's happening with money laundering, the extent of that money laundering, the example of what took place in British Columbia in terms of the casinos, BC real estate. We highlight what's been happening in the Greater Toronto area in terms of real estate and its connection to money laundering. So we've tried to put this out, as well as this question of trade-based laundering, to explain what the magnitude of this challenge is, and whether or not FinTrack, the organization that is seized with this ostensibly, does not necessarily have the legislative authority to collect a certain amount of information it would need. So we've laid this out in pretty clear paragraphs to to point out exactly what you raised, which is another growing area. And it's something I believe we may end up addressing. I can't prejudge, but as I said earlier, the committee is going to be pursuing a review of the federal policing mandate of the RCMP.
You have less than 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I would follow up. You half answered this question, but certainly there's some complications between the investigative authority of the RCMP, FinTrack, and then our intelligence agencies. So that coordinated approach is something that hasn't been looked at, but something that may need to be looked at going forward. Then is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
I think that's a fair statement. Absolutely.
Okay. 2.5 minutes for the Liberal.
Thank you.
Question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Andropoulos. Okay.
So thank you very much, Mr. McGuinty and team, for being here with us today to answer our questions. And thanks for the work that you do on this committee to protect Canadians. My question is about the spike in online hate and online hate groups. I can't help but notice the concern that people have with Bill C-10 and with people's belief that it would infringe on basic rights to express themselves and freedom of expression, which obviously our government has said it wouldn't do. But because this is the current fear, I'm wondering how our government could go forward. What you would recommend, or ways that you could see our government going forward with legislation to stop people who do organize hatred online and push that kind of an agenda on social media and online in order to kind of stop them. What ways can we help these groups or limit the ability of these groups to have a negative influence on Canadians?
I think you're raising, Ms. Lambropoulos, the $64,000 question. What is the appropriate balance between free speech and when that free speech crosses a line and becomes something else? It's not something the committee examined in terms of what's the remedy, what's the recommendation. In fact, this report was agnostic this year on recommendations. It wanted to present the magnitude of the risks. But we really hope that a committee like Public Safety, for example, might apply its collective mind to figure out what is the best way forward. We haven't examined C-10. It's being debated, but we haven't applied it to this particular set of challenges. But we may have more to say about this when we release our report on cyber activities, which we hope will be by the summer. And we may also have more to say about this when we are finished the review of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's federal policing mandate, given their role, the national organization with primary responsibility for national security investigations and organized crime, for example.
Thank you, Mrs. Lambropoulos. Madame Michaud, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your report, there's talk of organized crime and how organized crime is more and more complex, but that the nature of the threat hasn't really changed since 2018. This is a major problem in Montreal. There was a young woman, a 15-year-old woman, that was killed in a shootout. Someone probably had an illegal weapon. There was someone else who was arrested with 250 weapons, trying to import them from the United States. With all the information that you have on organized crime, is Canada doing enough to fight the illegal arms trade? Once again, this is something that the committee looked at directly, but this is an issue that will probably be reviewed when the committee looks into what's going on at the RCMP and the RCMP's mandate to conduct national police activities. But in our report, we didn't at all look into those issues directly.
Mr. Harris. 1 minute. You're on mute, Jack.
Thought I just fixed that. Sorry. In paragraph 71 and 72 of your report, you talk about Russia, China, and Iran having demonstrated intention to develop cyber attack capabilities. At the end of it, however, after suggesting that the Russians are already there, the CSIS notes, in the absence of a major crisis or armed conflict with Canada or the US, the intentional disruption of Canadian critical infrastructure remains unlikely. I don't know what that's supposed to mean and whether you agree with that or not. Surely it's only in a crisis that these types of things would happen. Are we up to the defense for that? Or do you evaluate that kind of a statement, or do you just repeat it here?
If I could, Mr. Harris, could I ask Mr. Jorgensen to respond to you directly on that?
Sure.
Sure. I mean, I guess the issue, it was in fact a CSE, Communication Security Establishment assessment, and that is that this type of activity goes on all the time. In fact, we see it with some of our allies in the Middle East who do the same thing, not necessarily in a crisis. And so that similar thing could happen in Canada. And however, the assessment of CSE is that the intention of a major state actor would be only displayed in the circumstance of a war.
Thank you. The next question will be a conservative. I don't know who the conservative is for the 2.5 minutes.
I can go.
Okay, Mr. Van Popta, 2.5 minutes.
Chair. Okay, so thank you, Mr. McGinty again, and for raising the issue of malicious cyber activity. I was very interested to hear what you had what your report has to say there, and also have to admit very, very alarmed. So this is foreign entities breaking into our security and stealing our intellectual property. So my question is really about that. How big of a threat is that of foreign entities, foreign companies, let's say, controlled by foreign governments, stealing our intellectual property and in that way threatening us economically?
So, Mr. Van Popta, in the report from paragraph 61 forward, 4 or 5 paragraphs in a row, we described that threat quite clearly. And the committee was unanimous, as it is behind all these paragraphs, that it wanted to name specifically China, the Russian Federation, Iran, and the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. CSE's information, which we represent here, says they continue to see cyber activity consistent with each actor's national strategic objectives, including in cyber activity against Canadian government networks, private sector systems, and critical infrastructure systems. So we do know, we've looked at enough evidence to conclude that China and Russia to continue to be the main drivers of cyber threat activity, targeting the government since 2018, since we last looked at this. And it's focusing across a whole series of government sectors. I just can't go into any more detail than that.
Of course, no, fair enough. No, thank you for that. So are these state-owned enterprises controlled by the Chinese Communist government or the Russian government, or are they private actors, or to what extent is it nation-to-nation issue?
Don't think I'm in a position to give you any more detail than the fact that the report refers to Chinese and Russian actors.
No, fair enough. I respect that. Thank you.
Thank
Is that
you,
my time?
Mr. Yep, you're pretty well done.
Thank you.
You are now. Final 2.5 minutes to the roll questioner. Failing which I'll take it if no one else will.
Why don't you take it, Chair?
Okay. Mr. McGinty, first of all, thank you for coming, and you've, I think, only hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of the overall threat assessment, and you have some limitations. I would like you to delve into the nature of the threat to our democracy. We saw in the last 4 years that the Russians were very successful in setting Americans off against each other, exaggerating the differences, if you will, and imperiling the actual expression of an American democracy. So I'd be interested in how you see both the Russian and the Chinese activities and how they operate to threaten our democracy. What's in specificity, in some specificity, please.
I wish I could be, Mr. Chair, more specific. We've been as specific as we possibly can be in the report in the Canadian context. But I would repeat that the evidence indicates that this is happening in the context of every political party in this country at all levels of government. It's about the deployment of individuals on Canadian soil directed by a foreign state actor. I would point committee members and Canadians to paragraph 70 and 74 as an example of the extent to which a foreign actor will go. We lay out what has ostensibly happened in the likely launching of a cyber attack against the Australian Parliament and its three largest political parties prior to the Australian general election, likely by China, in early 2019. We then go on to describe what happened in June 2020 when China likely conducted another large-scale cyber attack against Australia and Australian companies, hospitals, schools, and government officials. And in the case of the United States, in paragraph 74, since our report was published, the US Justice Department and Homeland Security confirmed that their voting machines weren't necessarily tampered with, but Russia clearly tried to influence the election by using sophisticated online disinformation campaigns. So we've captured that in the report to point out the nature and the extent and the level to which some state actors will go to disrupt the democracy that we have, which is why we made 4 or 5 major recommendations to the Prime Minister around this panel, 5-person panel, that is there to help blow the whistle if and when major irregularities would occur during a Canadian election. And we think that should be expanded. We think the membership should be varied. And we think the way in which Canadians are informed should be handled very carefully.
Thank you for the limitations to your answer. I understand it, but it's also frustrating to not understand the nature and extent of the threat to both our economy and our democracy in a more specific way. But thank you for your presentation. As you can see, there's a huge appetite in the members for the work of your committee. And I think on behalf of the members of the Public Safety Committee, not only you and Mr. Jorgensen are to be thanked, but if you'd also thank the other members of Parliament who have joined you, including our Mr. Motz, who I'm sure has contributed to your deliberations. So thank you. And with that, we'll suspend for a minute or two to let Mr. McGuinty and Mr. Jorgensen leave, and then ask Madame Demoff to present her emergency motion, and then we'll deal with the subcommittee's report. So suspend for 2 minutes. Is that good enough, Mr. Clerk?